Okay, we're on top of Spring Street here, looking back towards the Gulch to the east. Behind us is the Five Points MARTA station towards Peachtree Street. And the large brick building behind me was built as the Atlanta Constitution Building in 1948. It was occupied by that newspaper just for a few years until they merged with the Atlanta Journal and moved over to Marietta Street. And since then it was leased by Georgia Power for a while, but then the whole building has been vacant for many decades, possibly since the 80s or 70s. One reason for that is that it was purchased by the city of Atlanta because they wanted to build what they call a multimodal passenger terminal. They actually have this idea of they want to have a new terminal that is kind of an entry point for Atlanta. And there's been discussions of establishing a commuter rail network or possibly a regional rail network. And the idea is to tie that in with maybe our regional bus systems and our Amtrak and have all this built at a new, basically like a grand downtown terminal again. And so the idea was that it needed to go exactly where the Constitution Building is, and so that's one reason why it has it was stripped and has just been left vacant for a very long time. So that, and then also our vantage point of the Gulch here leads us to think about the ideas of redeveloping in these areas. More recently there's been an idea called the Green Line, which kind of picks up on the old Blakely plan of basically covering over the entire Gulch as a combination of park space and also
Jeff, can I stop here a second? Can you talk about what the Gulch is, what that means, and what that is?
Yeah, the Gulch, I actually don't know where the term of the Gulch originates. Right now it's pretty evident because we have all these elevated streets, and then below is this totally vacant zone that used to be railroad yards and now it's just surface parking. And so it's hard to define geographically, but it's this area that's almost abandoned and it's below street level. I suspect that name was probably in use while the railroads were still there, so it was still kind of a no man's land because it was completely built out with railroad yards, and it wasn't the kind of place you would go for a walk. And it may even predate the viaducts when the streets were raised, because portions of the area are lower, like the area behind me is lower than Marietta Street next to it, but it probably arose around the time that the streets were elevated. So there's always, especially now that the railroads are gone and it's this no man's land, and I actually kind of think of it like a dry riverbed. You know, if the railroads were the thing that Atlanta was built around, we don't have a waterfront. We have this very strange relationship to the Chattahoochee River, which is about 6 miles from our downtown. So there's a river and it's in sort of the city, but we have no relationship to it, and that's because the city was actually built around the railroads, and also because the Chattahoochee is not navigable, so it's really not useful for trade. So the city was built around the railroad junction, and then the railroad junction really moved. The tracks are still there, but all the, of course, the passenger trains are gone for the most part, and the freight unloading and loading all happens at other locations now. So to me it's like a dry riverbed right in this part of our city. So there's always discussions about what we do with it. Of course, a lot of it is now being occupied by around the convention center and the sports arenas, but more recently there's been this proposal called the Green Line plan, which really carries on the idea of the Blakely Plaza, which is to really cap the entire Gulch at this street level and make it a combination of green space and public plazas, and also introduce a lot more buildings and mixed use and try and bring in more density. One of the perceptions of certainly this part of the Gulch is that there's this big divide between the heavy amount of business and investment that happens around Woodruff Park and along Peachtree Street just north of here, and then the area south of here, which has yet to really get any kind of economic redevelopment. I actually think that that might have a lot more complexity to it than just this gap of the Gulch. There has been a lot of investment in federal buildings and state and county office buildings south of the Gulch, and so I think just adding more density right in this little one-block strip may not be all the solution. Unfortunately, most of the plans around either a new passenger terminal or mixed use or plaza space development around here haven't had a very strong historical component, and part of that is probably just not very many people are aware of the history. Part of it is that there are almost no physical remnants of the history of this area. And so the old Constitution building has really languished because in most of these plans it's either been called for to be torn down or is just a tiny afterthought almost. And you know, in Atlanta we tend to see this as symptomatic of a larger problem, that we have a lot of development initiatives that are very forward-looking but don't work very hard to build on the past or make connections to the past. And it's interesting when you read through sort of long histories of Atlanta, they often frame Atlanta from its very earliest days as being a boom town. And that really is what it was. I mean, it started around this railroad junction. It was about trade, and it grew very quickly from the beginning. It's always grown very quickly. And so maybe that's just sort of something about who we are, is that we tend to be more forward-looking and looking into the future, although maybe even short-term future, where we're always growing, we have a strong economy, and so we don't necessarily linger on the artifacts of our past. The other thing I like to point out about the Constitution building is the challenge it poses for preservation. It's a few blocks from where the old terminal station stood, and that was torn down in 1972, and I hear that referenced a lot by people who lived here then as sort of the one that got away. It was roughly concurrent with the loss of Penn Station in New York, which kind of kick-started their landmarks and their whole preservation movement. And so we lost buildings here in Atlanta, and people think, well, how could that happen? Even our glorious Fox Theater, which has been beautifully restored, was very close to demolition, and we think, how could that have happened? Well, I actually like to use the Constitution building as an example of what we face. Buildings tend to go in these pendulum swings. When they're about 50 or 60 years old, they tend to be obsolete. They generally haven't been maintained well over the last couple decades. They've been modified a great deal as their use has changed, and so it's really hard to appreciate the original architectural vision or the clarity of the original design, and it's usually really hard to imagine how it's going to be reused or repurposed. And so even the Fox Theater and the old terminal station were in those states. And the other thing is fashion changes, and usually when a building is about 60 years old, whatever fashion it was designed for is completely out of fashion at that time. So we lose a lot of buildings. Right now what we're facing is the early modernism is out of fashion, and it's hard to get people to think of it as historic preservation. And so we're losing a lot of the best examples of our early modernism, because it's not going to be for another 30 years when people and the general populace start to think, oh, hey, those were great buildings. Why did we tear those down? So the Constitution Building, to me, is an example of, you know, how it's hard to get the general public to really be motivated and proactive about saving buildings, because it's difficult and it takes a lot of work. We are now at what would be Mitchell Street, although the bridge over the tracks is currently being replaced. Behind me is the Nelson Street overpass, which has also been closed and just used for pedestrians. And that links over from sort of the government center part of downtown over to the Castleberry Hill district. And we're also at the site of Terminal Station, which was built in 1905. And it actually operated concurrently with Union Station. Now the site has the Richard Russell Federal Building, which is a tall, white, modernist structure, which is sort of the bane of many preservationists as sort of a before and after example. And so that was torn down in 1972. Basically, railroad passenger travel was declining continuously through the 60s, and 1972 pretty much coincided with the formation of Amtrak, when all the private railroads stopped carrying passengers. And so now we've gone from somewhere around 150 passenger trains every day at the height in the probably 1920s to basically 2 passenger trains, and so they stop it at a different location. They don't even actually come through downtown anymore. But we do have a series of buildings that were built around the station to serve it. Behind me over here are 2 long, narrow buildings that were the Southern Railway office buildings. They're currently vacant. They're actually still owned by the railroad, which is now Norfolk Southern, and potentially will be redeveloped as condos at some point. Behind me, to my left, is the old interlocking tower, and that worked a lot like a modern air traffic control tower at an airport. There was actually an identical one on the north side of the junction. So that marks the point that is basically the southwest corner of our triangular junction here. And originally that interlocking tower had a whole bank of levers that were physically interconnected with all the switches for all the tracks coming into this corner of the junction and serving the railroad station, and there was a guy there who could use the levers and actually control which track all the trains came into. And later on that was done electronically, and now it's done remotely. So that structure has been empty for many years. It's still owned by the railroad though. And it's a great example of that type of structure, and it also exhibits the same architecture as Terminal Station itself. It has the same brick and the terracotta tile roof, and this roughly has some of the Italianate characteristics that were more evident on the station itself.